I have brought some books this morning. I'm going to talk about these and not read them. I'm just going to talk about them in a minute, but I thought I'd set them there and give you a little bit of an illustration. Thursday evening, earlier in the week, I'd stopped by the TAP office, checked the mail, checked our cabinet, and it was full of books. There were 11 boxes of books in there. I don't know who they came from or what they were, their background. I have no idea. I didn't. And so I just loaded them up on the cart and rolled them inside the office real quick there and worry about them later. And so Thursday night after dinner, it was kind of quiet at our house, and Desi was working on some stuff on the computer. I think she was working on some church things, and we had eaten early, and so it was only like 5:30 or so. And I said to Des, I said, you mind if I go over to TAP for a little bit? I want to see what all that stuff is and just kind of nose around and see what it was. And so I left and ran over there and started going through the books. And I took these boxes, old books. They're all old, obviously been around for many, many years, and began to sort them out and put them on the table there at TAP and began to put them in different piles either by author or by subject. And as I was doing it, I began to see a pattern. I began to see a couple patterns come out. And I don't know, maybe it's me because I'm a pastor, but I always want to know kind of the background of all these books. And began to sort them out, and first thing I noticed was I knew most of the authors. They were authors that I was familiar with, which I don't pretend to have a great expanse of knowledge on authors. The longer I'm at TAP, I'll figure that stuff out. But right now, I don't know them all, but I have a general idea. But these were ones that I knew. These were John R. Rice, R.G. Lee, R.A. Torrey, Harry Ironside, people that were in my dad's library, if you know what I mean. Things that have been around, good, solid books. And they're all old books. And so I began to sort them out, and I began to have an increasingly large number, big pile, of books in particular on the subject of Revelation, the rapture, the millennium, things like that became quite a big area. So you could really quickly begin to gather that wherever these books came from, there was an emphasis there. And so I began to open up some of the books just to look at them, because some of them are so worn. I think some of these are so worn you can't really read the title. So I opened them up to see the titles. I realized they all came from the same man, Russell A. Hepner of Dauphin County. And it says Russell A. Hepner, teacher. I have no idea who that was. I don't know. I grabbed a couple of the books, some of the ones that you see here and a few others, and took them home with the intention of giving them to Destiny because, and I hope this doesn't scare you, but, she's an amazing sleuth on the internet and can uncover everything, And so I'm like, I'll just give these to Desi. She'll figure out who these people are and what this is from and where these books came from and stuff. It just intrigued me. And so she did. She began to look it up and quickly came to the conclusion that he was a Brethren pastor in the Harrisburg area in the early 1900s. And it says Russell Hepner teacher, but he was actually a preacher. He had the stamp made up. This must have been something, and I find interesting, it must have been something people did years ago, right? Everybody marked their books. I see that a lot, at least at TAP. The older the books, the more likely they are to have a lot of information. And this one's brief. Some of his have where he bought it, how much he paid for it, when he read it, what sermons he preached that came out of this book, or things he got out of it. Chapter 7's the best chapter I ever read on the subject of sin. Chapter 4 is the best chapter I ever read. Chapter 3 I don't agree with. He'd mark it all down in the front of the book and write it all down. All this stuff, which I found intriguing and very interesting. And anyway, Desi figured out kind of who he was the best we could. The internet doesn't have a lot about him. He passed away long before the internet was around. And so I don't know Pastor Russell Hepner. I'm pretty sure he pastored the Paxton Brethren Church. Little church, still there, little Brethren Church on the backside of Harrisburg. And probably came from the church. I'm guessing the church probably cleaned out their library. That's usually what's happening today, and they dropped him off. And he was their pastor like 100 years ago, literally. Right? This book in particular that I'm holding in my hand was one of those many, many books on Revelation. I picked it up. And after that, we were getting ready to go to bed, and we knew we were going to watch our grandson Mason on Friday. And Desi said, I've got to go to bed early because Mason's coming. So, the house got real quiet real early and lights went off. But I stayed up for a while with this book. And I didn't know anything about it. Jesus is Coming, the author W.E.B. Does that mean anything to anybody? Does that, anybody? Me either. And that's a shame. W.E.B., I found out, was William E. Blackstone, a pastor. He, just to give you a little bit of history, he signed up to help the North in the Civil War. But he was too frail, and they wouldn't let him fight. And he got relegated to what is now the Red Cross. So he worked specifically for Ulysses S. Grant's division, army, as he was promoted through before he finally became the commander of the whole North. But he worked specifically for Ulysses S. Grant as a Red Cross worker, helping the wounded. After the war, he fell under conviction, got saved, got right with God, began to preach, and wrote a couple things, not a lot, but a couple things. This book called Jesus is Coming was his best-selling book. I'll get to that in a minute. But he was best well known for the Blackstone Project, which I never heard of. The Blackstone Project is something he wrote because he was under conviction that the nation of Israel needed to be restored to their land, and that America needed to do something about that. That was the emphasis of his writing. So this is, again, early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. He began to write this Blackstone Project. He went out and got support for it, personally went to get support, signatures on it, and got signatures like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, the Supreme Court Justice of the United States. All these signed on to this, that, yeah, this sounds right. Why? Listen, why? Because the Bible said so. Right? But they all agreed that this was really important. And obviously, he died in 1936. W.E.B. died in 1936, 12 years before the nation of Israel actually were restored to their land in 1948. And so he never saw it come to fruition, which we're going to get to. But it's written that the Supreme Court and the government leaders of the 1940s said the most influential piece of writing that secured what our country thought about the nation of Israel was the Blackstone Project, written by W.E.B. And if you look everywhere, he's only referred to as W.E.B. You have to really dig to find the Blackstone name. Wikipedia said, he's a man who was famous in his lifetime, but has been relegated to obscurity in his death. Nobody knows who he is. Very influential in his life. Nobody knows who he is now that he's died. Wikipedia said the best-selling book he had was Jesus is Coming. They said it was printed over 3 million times in 48 languages. It was used by pastors around the world. I picked it up and said to myself, I've never heard of this. And so I stayed up late that night, even though Mason was coming the next day. And he's going to wear me out. I picked it up and began to read through it. I'm like, where is, what's his doctrine? It's all about the second coming of Jesus Christ and the rapture. I'm like, what's his doctrine? He wrote this 1878. 1878. This particular copy was a reprint of 1909, but 1878 he wrote this little book. Millions of copies in print. What did it say? And so I went through and looked up what he said about the rapture, what he said about the second coming, what he said about premillennialism, and all the things that are tenets of our faith today at Cedar Hill Baptist Church. And just to summarize real quick, he said this: there are new doctrines out there of postmillennial and amillennialism that are in errancy, that are wrong, they're against the Word of God, and he's writing this book to correct the errors of the day. I'm like, and that was like 150 years ago. Look at the errors we have today. But he wrote this book and wrote it all, got it all right as far as I'm concerned, as far as I think we would be concerned, as far as our bylaws would stand, as far as the authors that we would hold to today, the Dwight Pentecost, on his book Things to Come, would be an expanded version of this. It's just, he got it right. I thought, here's a man who spent his life writing and preaching about the fact that Jesus is coming again. 150 years ago. And then let me move forward so that in the early 1920s and 30s, an unknown preacher on the backside of Harrisburg called Pastor Hepner of a little Brethren church, again, all these things are written in these books. He went to a conference in Virginia, Richmond, Virginia, bought this book for 25 cents. Yeah, how about that? And it formed his decisions and opinions on what future events were. And you know that because of all of his other books on Revelation. They're all consistent in their doctrine and their theme. He wasn't just pulling stuff. He was consistent in a biblical stand of what the Bible has to say on things to come. I was reminded, as I was looking at that, of Hebrews 11:13. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them and embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. These were guys who believed that Jesus was coming again. And they stood in pulpits in the 1870s, 1880s, 1920s, 1930s, and they preached to their congregations, listen, Jesus is coming again. Jesus is coming, and these guys died. They're gone. The internet tells us we have forgotten about them, they said. We've forgotten about them. One of them had outright said it. The other one, the internet has no information on. We don't know who they are. They're gone. These all died, not having received the promise, but having seen it afar off. One more little note, and then I'll get into the crux of my message. On the inside of this little book, again, this is a reprint from 1908. The first little recommendation is from a preacher named R.A. Torrey. I hope you've heard of him. R.A. Torrey was a pastor of Moody Church. He followed Moody. R.A. Torrey said, this book, Jesus is Coming, written by W.E.B, I'm telling you, it's all he was referred to, was the first book that made the coming of Jesus Christ a living reality to me. I had already been convinced that our Lord's coming would be before the millennium, having reached the conclusion in studying the works of named some Danish theologian. But it was merely a theological conception until I read this book. It was that first that brought me to the definite convictions and made the doctrine not only clear, but precious in my preaching. Think of the impact R.A. Torrey had and Moody had in all of those years. These men believed the Word of God, preached the Word of God, stood on the Word of God. And when other false, what they clearly saw as false invasions of different doctrines began to come their way, they stood firm on the Word. And they wrote about it and were convinced about it and preached about it and had an impact about it. And listen, the world has forgotten them. But the teachings that they gave us are so important to where our doctrine is today.